Good morning. We are going to continue our review of the books of the Bible, and this morning we will be looking at the book of Deuteronomy. This is a book that is often given short shrift, mainly because of its connections with Leviticus. We get to Leviticus, and maybe if we get through Leviticus, we finally move on. We're so happy to be out of the law sections, and we get to the book of Deuteronomy and we think that it's just Leviticus part 2. And we want to see this morning that that's not exactly the case. And so we can begin by looking at how the title leads us into thinking that, and that's actually a problem. Our title, Deuteronomy, actually comes from the English version, or the English title comes from Deuteronomy 17 at verse 18. It says, "And when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law approved by the Levitical priest." And so this is translated from the Septuagint, that is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, as Deuteronomos, or second law. And thus we have the name Deuteronomy. And sadly, we come away from that thinking, oh, well, it's just a second telling, or even worse, a second law. And that's not exactly what's going on here. The Hebrew title is "These are the words," which is the first phrase in the book. And I think that's a better understanding of what's going on here, because Deuteronomy is just a record of Moses's sermons on the law. There's 3 in particular. And so I think that maybe helps us better understand what's going on in the book a little bit more than our English title. Again, we're going to keep calling it Deuteronomy, and I think that's okay. But we need to understand that that phrase could be a little misleading if we don't know what is in the book. Before we get into anything else, I want to talk about the purpose of the book, because it is Moses's sermon or sermons on the law. And I really like what Walton and Hill had to say in their kind of introduction, their overview of the Old Testament about this. They say that it is a charter document of Israel that emphasizes that there is one God, one people of God, one sanctuary, and one law. And so we see the unity of religion around God, this people, and what is going to be a place, one place. And so I like that language, that this is kind of the charter document, kind of helps us to better appreciate what's going on in the book. Let's look at the structure of the book, because if you just start reading, you may kind of get a little overwhelmed with what all is going on. You kind of like to have a big picture or a map of what's going on. We can start very simply. There's a very simple structure, and that is that you can divide it into 3 sections, and that's 3 sermons of Moses. And so the first section is just 1:1 through 4:44, and this tells us what God has done. Then in the next section, we see what Israel must do. And then we see in the third section, the final section, what God will do. And you can see just in this simple breakdown that the emphasis, the majority of this text is going to be spent on the rules and regulations given to Israel and what they must do. One thing that we can benefit by historical study, by archaeology, and this kind of a thing, is seeing what other nations, what other peoples were doing at this time. And one of the regular things that we see are the covenants or contracts, if you will, these treaties of these ancient peoples. And so we see the treaties that the Hittites had and other nations, and we begin to understand how they crafted these treaties, how they crafted these covenants. And what we find out is that Deuteronomy really falls into some of the same patterns. And so we see this book as a treaty or a covenant between God and his people. And these treaties began with a preamble. They then were followed by a historical prologue. And in Deuteronomy, we see that this is where Moses reviews what God has been doing for the people of Israel and bringing them up out of Egypt and protecting them as they go through the wilderness. And then we have the large portion of the document of the Treaty of the Covenant that is about the stipulations. What all is going on here, what is going to need to be done by the people to kind of remain in this covenant here. Then there is what is a document clause, maybe gives some kind of instruction for a regular reading of this covenant, this treaty. And we see in Deuteronomy 27 verses 1 through 10, when they get over into the promised land, they were to write all these things on a stone, and that was to be kind of a memorial for them. In these documents, we see a section that often involves the blessings and curses of the law. We see the blessings for obeying the law, and we see the curses for disobedience to this law. And then finally, we have a summoning of witnesses. Now, in these ancient covenants, these ancient treaties from other nations, they would often summon the sun, the moon, and the stars, the gods as witnesses. And so we see something similar to that, obviously not other deities are summoned in Deuteronomy. But we see that these covenants, these treaties from the secular world, are very similar to what we see in the book of Deuteronomy. Now, the problem with this is when we see these laws, we kind of come away thinking that it's just all about obedience to a law, and that's all there is. And in his commentary on Deuteronomy, Daniel Block wants to kind of get rid of this idea. And so I love some of the things that he says here. I want to share these with you. He says that these are not a burden, but a response to the supreme and unique privilege of knowing God's will. We sometimes look at laws and we think, oh, look at this, just trying to oppress us. And he says, no, this is a privilege of knowing what God would have you to do. He further says this is not a precondition to salvation, but the grateful response of those already saved. You'll remember God brought Israel out of Egypt before he ever made a covenant with them. He delivered them. And so this is a response to those who have been saved from Egyptian bondage. He says it's not just a duty imposed by one party or another, but an expression of covenant love. This is not something we do because we have to. The law says we must. No, the idea is we do this out of covenant love for one another. He says it's not just an external act, but evidence of the circumcision of one's heart with the disposition of fear of and love for God. It's not just about the physical, it was about the heart as well. And he makes that point very clear there. And then finally, he says this is not a pressured response to a tyrant, but a willing subordination of one's entire being to the gracious divine suzerain. And that is the king that you are submitting to. This is not something that the people were doing because they were terrified that God would strike them dead. No, God had already delivered them. God was wanting to be their God and wanting them to be his people. And so they willingly submitted to these rules, to these regulations, to these laws. You'll remember when they're at Mount Sinai, they hear the 10 Commandments. They're afraid. They're so intimidated by God's voice, by God's presence. They say, whatever he says, we will do because of what God had already done. So we come back to our outline of the covenant, of this treaty, and we emphasize this this third section as being the longest, the stipulations, the commandments, the things that Israel was going to have to do. And as you read through these, there can be or seem to be a lot of randomness in these. And so scholars have studied for a long time about the organization here. And they seem to maybe have found a loose structure in this section around the Decalogue or the Ten Commandments. And so I'm just going to put up the 10 commandments here, numbers 1 through 10, obviously, and give the corresponding section of Deuteronomy. The first commandment goes with Deuteronomy 6 through 11, the second, Deuteronomy 12, and so forth and so on. And this has become a very popular way of finding some organization and structure within this section of law and stipulation. I know this is kind of a lot to take in. You can go back through the video. You can pause it if you want to take the notes here. But this also comes from Hill and Walton's overview and summary of Deuteronomy. And thinking about all this, they call it a legislative portfolio for each of the 10 commandments in order to discuss their implications, fine points, and broader consequences. And so it's just Moses expanding upon these laws. And the idea is that there's more to these laws than just the letter of the law. There is also the spirit of the law. And I think this is something that Jesus would get at in the Sermon on the Mount when he says, you have heard that you shall not kill. And he says, but I say to you, don't even be angry with your brother. And so Moses, likewise, here in Deuteronomy, is expounding upon the individual commandments in these sections. One thing that we really want to drill down to here before we wrap up this summary is that this is a covenant of reciprocal love. That it's not just, like Daryl Block said, those phrases we looked at earlier, it's not just law and rote obedience. There is a love here that we have for God, that we are trying to return to him. And we do that through the means that he has given us, and that is through obedience. Jesus said, if you love me, keep my commandments. And so we do that with God. And we see this in what is typically referred to as the Shema. Deuteronomy 6, verse 4, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone, or the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. We know that the New Testament talks about this being the first and great commandment. And then we see another passage that drills down to the foundation here. That is Deuteronomy 10 at verse 12. So now, O Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you? Only to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the commandments of the Lord your God and his decrees that I am commanding you today for your own well-being. And so the idea is that we give our love to God. We return or strive to return what he has given to us. He has shown us love. We give him love back. But with him being the great king, with him being God, he has the right to stipulate what that looks like. And it comes through in the form of keeping his commandments. And we do that because we love him. And that's the idea here. He has shown us love, and we are going to love him back. So there's Deuteronomy in a little bit condensed form, but I think it's helpful when you get ready to dig in and read this book. If you kind of have that layout before you, you can kind of see what's going on. Maybe you won't get overwhelmed. You kind of have a map to better understand where you're going, and hopefully that will help. That's the Pentateuch. Those are the 5 books of Moses. And now we will get into the historical books, starting with Joshua. So we have a nice chunk of the Old Testament done here. And hopefully these 5 reviews or overviews were helpful and will help you better read the Word of God. See you next time.